Welcome to the latest installment of our review sessions. For this one, we're going to talk about the cultural geography unit. This is a unit we do some strange stuff with throughout the year. We kind of break it up into different pieces and cover different parts of it. I do this to try to have us emphasize some of the vocabulary and some of the concepts from the cultural geography unit, which I think are often kind of difficult to wrap your head around kind of in isolation. So I try to have us cover them 2 or 3 times. So what I'm going to do with this is we are going to have 3 separate videos. The first one is going to cover just basic vocabulary and concepts from cultural geography itself. And then we're going to have 2 other videos, one on religion and one on language, that covers some basic stuff that we talked about. It gives us a chance to talk about things like cultural diffusion and globalization in the context of religion and language. So the definition of culture is defined as the shared practices, technologies, attitudes, and behaviors transmitted by a society. So the ones we talk about a lot in class are religion and language. But all these other things we have touched on and talked about: food in the context of kind of the agriculture unit, the built-in environment we're going to talk about in the context of the urban geography unit a lot, and kind of various city models and how cities are laid out and things like that. I always find this is kind of a difficult thing to teach on its own. I would encourage you, I think a better way to learn about culture is to actually try to watch some stuff that has to do with other cultures. Or one game that we played in class a little bit was GeoGuessr. That was a fun way to go around and kind of analyze the cultural landscape of other places. But things like kind of Anthony Bourdain type shows, or really anything like that that's on Netflix or Amazon, is a good way to kind of put on your geographer hat and look at various culture, kind of elements of culture across the world. So that's always a really good kind of way to do that kind of stuff. They always ask kind of weird questions on the AP exam. Probably not this year, I guess, since there's no multiple choice questions. But they always ask weird things on the AP exam that are hard to explicitly teach, but favor kids who tend to really like to watch that kind of thing and go deep into it. Yeah, but that was kind of a tangent. But religion, language, kind of housing, built environment, cultural landscape, food preferences, access to technology and the technologies itself, and just other attitudes or preferences related to culture, things related to gender, dress, all sorts of other things we would put into the umbrella of culture. So in class, we kind of differentiated between what we call folk culture and what we call popular culture. So folk culture includes things like smaller scale languages, oftentimes endangered or dying languages, basically languages that are not big kind of universal languages spoken by large amounts of people, but are spoken by relatively fewer speakers. Local forms of music and dance, kind of local food customs that we would still associate with specific places. The attitude I give, even though we have things like Popeyes, I guess, that are a little bit more popular culture, kind of Louisiana Creole cuisine, and then native or ethnic religions that we would still specifically associate with their hearth and not sort of the spread of them. So folk cultures are oftentimes more anonymous in terms of their origins or rooted in tradition, or I sometimes kind of blends of different cultures themselves, and more likely to be found in rural or isolated indigenous communities. Whereas popular culture are basically the things that you probably think of as popular culture are popular culture. English as a language, religions like Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism, and then, like McDonald's and popular music and professional sports leagues like the English Premier League and the NBA. So bigger kind of things that we have more of a global footprint. Origins often known, and are basically forces of cultural globalization that are influenced and adapt very quickly, and tend to be associated with kind of big, major urban areas, kind of global command centers and places like New York City or London or Tokyo, or increasingly bigger cities in China like Hong Kong and Beijing as well. So going further, we're going to get a little bit into a term that we talked a lot about, again, a few different times throughout the year, cultural diffusion. So the movement of cultural traits from one place to another is called diffusion. So we know there are different types of diffusion. So this is going to give us a little bit about the why and the process itself. So the place in which something begins is termed the hearth. So for instance, Seattle would be the hearth of Starbucks in terms of the company, but maybe you would consider kind of grunge music, or maybe one of the two or three different hearths along with Silicon Valley of kind of the tech boom economy, things like that. And the diffusion of ideas or things occurs through communication, observations, marketing, or physical means. So some different things to point out that are reasons for large-scale diffusion are things like colonization and imperialism. So those especially come into play when we talk about religion and language and how they spread throughout the world and why they spread to specific places and why they didn't spread to other places. Trade is another process by which ideas and elements of culture are diffused. And also the term sequent occupancy, which this is a term we didn't talk quite about as much this year, but basically it means basically the footprint that one culture leaves on the physical environment and how it influences the next group of people that live there. So sequent occupancy is a term that I just saw going through the course outline that I wanted to highlight. So you can kind of think about in the context of maybe how Native American names of places affect the naming of places for the United States or Mexico, things like that. That's just kind of an example off the top of my head of what I would consider to be sequent occupancy. So getting into the types of cultural diffusion, we have 4 different types. So relocation diffusion is in and of itself kind of its own type of cultural diffusion. And that is basically when an element of culture spreads from one place and to another through the physical relocation of humans to that new place. So again, I always think of religion and language in the context of this, but obviously it took actual people back in the 15th and the 16th and the 17th century to spread things like the English language and Christianity to new places. So that is associated with specific people moving to a new place. Where expansion diffusion and the 3 types of expansion diffusion are basically how an element of culture would diffuse within a geographic area. So just kind of running through those 3 types. Hierarchical diffusion is when an element of culture is passed down through some sort of social or political hierarchy. So that might mean by a leader within the country, a president or a king, or someone that has a lot of political power, or that might mean through advertising or through a celebrity or somebody that might wield some sort of social power within the country. So lots and lots of things probably would diffuse through hierarchical diffusion in our country. The second one is a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around. It's called stimulus diffusion, and it is associated with when the idea of something spreads, but elements of it are changed to fit local customs or to fit the new place itself. So an example I always give is food. Food is to me a good example of stimulus diffusion because we have all various types of food that spread from place to place, but oftentimes when it spreads to a new place, something about it is changed to sort of appeal to the group of people that already live there. So I always think of, what Chinese food looks like in the United States and how things like chicken are substituted in as the more heavily within the dishes and things like that. And the last part is contagious diffusion, where an element of culture kind of diffuses from person to person, either in person or on the internet, which is an increasingly increasingly associated with contagious diffusion is the diffusion of memes and the diffusion of content from person to person on the internet. So the last thing to talk about within the slide is the term distance decay. So we already talked about this in the context of migration. But distance decay is basically the relationship of kind of how something spreads to distance, meaning that elements of culture are oftentimes more likely to spread to closer geographic areas than they are to areas that are farther away. So this has a lot in common with how we apply distance decay to migration in the last video, where we talked about how people are more likely to move to a new place that's closer than farther away. And again, it's not a super innovative theory, I don't think, but something that probably makes sense when you think about it. And the opposite of this, the term that's opposite of this, is called time-space compression. And that was referring to the increases in technology that make it easier for things to spread from person to person across the world. So things like the internet and international trade might be vehicles of time-space compression. The last slide we're going to cover is basically how cultures change as new elements of culture diffuse to them. So these are three terms that you need to know: assimilation, acculturation, and syncretism. So assimilation is when people of a given minority culture are adopted into the majority culture. Acculturation is when people experience cultural changes as a result of meeting between two cultures. So they're kind of associated more with the retention of some aspects of minority culture or cultures being practiced side by side in some ways. And syncretism is the blending of beliefs and practices between different cultures, kind of the creation of something new. So within this, I always think of things like pidgin languages or more hybrid religions that might exist as examples of syncretic culture. All right, so next time we'll get more into religion, and then after that, language. Thanks. Bye.